Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to Disrupting the Future with building generative AI products with just-in-time consumer insights. I'm Katie Johnson. I've spent the last 2.5 years building and shipping products that are built on top of Gen AI and LLM technology. First at Google, I was in charge of the product that immediately preceded Bard from the UXR side, and then I was the lead UX researcher on Bard from December 2022 to May of 2023. And now more recently at PanasonicWELL, where I am the global head of consumer insights. I started my career with 2 degrees in aerospace engineering, and I've held roles in all different parts of an organization, from human factors engineering to product management, a brief stint in marketing, innovation strategy, and most of my career has been spent in kind of more formal UX research roles. I've worked at everything from agencies to conglomerates and to tiny startups, but I've really made my career at the intersection of human needs and emerging technology like VR, AR, blockchain, and most recently AI. Okay. Cool. Oh no, I got muted. Okay. Before we dig into talking about the technology, I am going to pause for a minute and tell you a little bit more about myself as a human. I find myself thinking about being a human a lot these days and what's going to remain human for us in the coming years and decades. In addition to being a technologist and an experienced person, I'm a mother of 2 kids under 5 and a partner to Kevin Johnson, who will be speaking tomorrow, actually. And while this photo, in fact, all the photos or all the images rather in this deck are generated by generative AI, and this image is in no way an accurate representation of what our family looks like. For one, my husband and I are the same height, and our kids are a little bit younger than that. This is representative of the environment in which we are raising our kids and showcases some of the wondrous things I've been able to kind of savor and remember are uniquely human over these past couple of years of working in the space. The different roles that I've held and the background that I come from has really shaped how I think about building products over the 15 years I've been in my career. And in the roles that I've played, especially because I've served in so many cross-functional spaces, engineering, marketing, innovation, strategy, and design, I've come to know that successfully building and shipping meaningful products requires us to, 1, identify and design the minimum viable experience and iterate quickly. 2, become best friends with your product and eng teams and all of your cross-functional partners, because alignment is elusive and extremely essential for building fast and shipping. And, of course, that building and testing experiences with the product early and with our users is essential to get to a really meaningful launch. So when I got into building products in Gen AI and specifically LLMs, I realized that while a lot of the things I knew how to do were going to be relevant, were going to come back and be useful in my career in that particular technology, some of them were distinctly different. So just, have to acknowledge the beautiful AI generated image of a human hand. Let's start with what stays the same. So I still think that alignment on product teams and willingness to experiment, and specifically willingness to fail, is the single biggest indicator of whether or not a team will have success long-term in product development. Building flawed successes and efficient failures is what it's all about. I still believe that you get to alignment by understanding the key assumptions that you're making and by prioritizing those as a group. Personally, I'm a big fan of multi-dimensional, 2-dimension specifically prioritization tools. I'm a big fan of the importance difficulty one, impact uncertainty, whatever you use, as long as you're looking at things multidimensionally, not just what it means to the user, but how much work it's going to take the organization to prove or disprove it. I think you're doing great. So continue to use tools like that to prioritize assumptions. And then we have to build and test against the biggest assumptions on the list. And, to be candid, those are the things that if you get them wrong or you are incorrect about them, they're going to screw you over. You're not going to succeed if your assumptions are incorrect. So you want to test those quickly and de-risk the product as fast as possible. I still believe, as someone who spent 10 years in specifically UX research roles, that observation-based research, getting to observe people's behaviors as they're happening and then being able to understand why they're doing what they're doing, is the key to making the best judgment calls about what to build next. And kind of my signature philosophy on how I practice is that I believe that alignment inevitably means changing minds. So research that you build and products that you test have to be designed to witness the things you're assuming so that either you or other members of your team can realize that you're correct and double down on what you're doing, or realize you're wrong, or at least partially wrong, and pivot. And spoiler alert, everybody's going to be wrong. That's just the name of the game. If you're not taking big enough swings, if you're right all the time, you're probably not taking big enough swings. So before we go on, let's pause and acknowledge something really important. That's a lot of things that are going to stay the same. There's a lot of things that everyone in this room and everyone that watches this recording knows how to do that you'll continue to be able to use and will bring you success going forward. And I want to really acknowledge that that's important for us to think about. There's a lot that's going to stay the same in product development. But now I want us to talk about generative AI and LLMs specifically and how those technologies make what we do a little bit different in product design and development. So before we get there, I'm going to leave you with kind of bring in an anecdote. Over this past weekend, I was having a conversation with an older gentleman who's worked in technology his entire career, and my husband, who works in AI at Scout now. The older gentleman was telling us that he believed that AI and generative AI LLMs specifically were just the latest in a long line of new technology that seems really impressive and has a lot of froth around it, and it's going to fade away as time goes on. And my husband made a really excellent point that I wanted to share with you, which is that, yes, that's the case for many technologies, but he and we believe that this technology, this wave, specifically with Gen AI and LLMs, is going to feel less like a momentary craze around blockchain or NFTs or VR, and more like the mass availability and adoption of the internet or the advent of the smartphone, where we see people, the way that people, individuals, and organizations do business is going to get upended and change, possibly forever in perpetuity. So with that analogy, let's dig into what is different about building on this tech. The core thesis that if you learn nothing else from me today that I want you to walk away with is that building on AI and generative AI means giving up control. And as someone who likes to be in control, this is a tough one for me to kind of stomach, right? But one of the greatest things that happened to me in the time that I was at Google working on this technology is I was able to meet some of the folks that were responsible for the parts of underlying tech that make LLMs possible. And the most fascinating and wonderful thing about those people was how humble they were. They would sit and have coffee with me and tell me that they didn't really know how it works, that it's a black box at the core. In the product design and development space, I often hear from folks that they're feeling behind or nervous or out of touch about diving into AI, that there's so much to learn and they're behind. They can't possibly catch up. I want y'all to realize that this is really ultimate imposter syndrome behavior. If the folks that design this tech don't know how it works, it's okay if you don't know how it works either. And what I invite you to do is bring your curiosity and your humility that you already bring to everything you do to this new endeavor, and realize that at most you're a year or two, a couple years max behind the front runners. But the reality is that the technology is changing drastically on a minute-to-minute basis. So even if you're behind, everyone is behind too. We're learning together, and we need your brains and your heart. So I encourage you to, hold your nose and dive in. This is the moment, and we are here to help get you on board. What this means is that we need to look at product design, product development, product management, and all of the disciplines that contribute to that as alchemy, not hard science. And what I'm going to spend the rest of my talk on today is kind of the two flavors of control and the lack of control that I think about when I think about building and shipping on this kind of technology. First, we're going to talk about, for us, the makers of the product, who can now only aspire to build the product that we dream of and try really hard to get there, but we're never going to be able to be perfect about it anymore. And then for our users who are operating in a world where they may not have a mental model for how this type of product works today or in perpetuity. So let's start with the idea of building a product atop a technology we cannot control. As designers, product, and research folks, this means that we need to upend our orthodoxies. If you've ever heard me speak before, you've heard me talk about orthodoxies, which are deeply held beliefs that we've created over time, largely by having success, right? Orthodoxies come to us because we've had success in the past, and they teach us that if we do this thing again, it's a heuristic, that then we're going to enjoy success going forward. The most important thing to know about orthodoxies, though, is that they all have expiration dates. And especially when we see a big wave of technology changing how we practice, it's important to look and check on the things that we take for granted and see if with the new technology, it may be worth changing how we think about it. So let's get really concrete and specific. We've spent the past few decades building products under the assumption that the products that we create are fixed. They're the same for every single person that uses them. And in fact, that's really important to guarantee a good experience, right? That if one person opens up an application and another person opens up an application, they're going to have the same experience. If we take that assumption for granted, we can then make another assumption that we've taught people, that we can conduct experiments like usability tests, where we bring independent variable, the user, into a room with a dependent variable, the product, to see how the users interact with the product. And what's more, we've learned over the past couple decades that by doing this with a really small n, like even 5 to 8 people, we can find 80% of the things that are most problematic about the product and quickly iterate and change those things to make a much better experience. And we have built entire series of products and services together by teaching folks to build and iterate this way. This is basically how 0 to 1 startups work. Now, with LLMs making up the backbone of these products, what we're dealing with is the fact that the product itself is no longer a dependent variable. The only thing that's held constant from user to user is the first screen they see, and if we control it, the opening volley from the model. Now, of course, the UI, the colors, the accessibility of the screen, those things are still things that we can control. But if we're talking about a product that's reliant on LLM for part of its interaction, we're talking about something that now, after the very first after the very first interaction, diverges from user to user, because the user's responses will drastically affect what they get back from the model. Meaning that 5 to 8 users now interacting with the model will have 5 to 8 completely different experiences based on where their conversation takes them. And these experiences will ultimately morph into relationships between the users and the LLMs, which, as an aside, if you're interested in learning more about that, I gave a talk about relationship UI actually at D-Scout's collab in October last year in Chicago. That talk is on the internet. It's connected to my LinkedIn, so you can check that out. It's 12 minutes long and meant to be kind of a sister talk to this one. So if you want to learn more about relationship UI, I would encourage you to check that out and check out D-Scout collab, where there's lots of conversations going on about that. Okay, so how do we test something like this? And aren't LLMs really expensive and complicated to build, train, fine-tune? Yes, they are. So if we agree that the most important thing to test is no longer the interface, but the true experience, that budding relationship that I'm talking about, then we have to find a way to test that. And most importantly, I encourage you to realize that this means testing in as longitudinal a setting as is reasonably achievable, because we need to see people interacting over time, not just instantaneously. Relationships evolve over time, and forcing ourselves to witness them in a foreshortened period will hinder our ability to view them honestly. And when I say longitudinal, I don't necessarily mean using traditional methods like diaries, although I find those to be really great as well. But these can be discrete methods that you just kind of stack in a longitudinal nature. The longitudinal part comes from recruiting the same folks back over and over again and letting them interact with a model a couple days or even weeks later during an interview or text-based setting. So you can have people come into an interview, not even really talk to them in the course of the interview, but just let them interact with the model, right? That's a really safe way, controlled environment, where you can start to see how people are playing with it. That feels ultimately a little more longitudinal if you have those people come back over several sessions. A couple other thoughts on this that I wanted to share before we go on is that I also believe that if we're talking about studying a user interacting with the model long-term or longitudinally, we also ultimately will need to think about the relationship from the user perspective and the machine perspective. That's not something I've had the opportunity to do yet, but I think it's going to be hugely important to understand what the machine with the LLM, the bot, is thinking about the person, what they know about them. You could argue with the concept of how they feel about the user, right? Like, these are really interesting concepts that we probably should ultimately bring into our practices as well. Because what we're trying to do is design and support and create an ideal relationship, which could change from user to user and possibly inside a single user between session and session. So herein lies the problem. Building and training an LLM from scratch, or even fine-tuning an existing LLM, is expensive and time-consuming. And that's even when you know what you want to build. By the time you're going to make the significant investment required to build it, if you're talking about relationships, it could be costly or even too costly to change it. So how could you build an airplane when you're flying it? I would say it's easy. It's not easy. It's definitely doable, but it's not easy. And the answer is you fake it till you make it, and maybe even a little bit after you make it. So in the last 2.5 years, I've built tens, which sounds like a really sad small number, but in this world, that's actually a pretty big number of tests where we are having end users interact with bots that are being played by humans. Very Mechanical Turk, Wizard of Oz, Man Behind the Curtain vibes. And guess what? It works. I'll give you specific examples so you can hear kind of how I think about this. We learned a ton about how people interacted with bots, and what kinds of things were problematic. Even something as simple as language, length of response, tone. If you're not already following Kevin Roose in the New York Times and his articles on AI, absolutely do that. He writes incredible articles that are very similar to work that I've done in the past. He's just doing it in daylight, which is really awesome, not inside one of the companies. So I would encourage you to read his articles, the most recent of which he wrote a couple of weeks ago about friendships with chatbots and how they evolved over the course of a month. It hits on a lot of the things that I talked about in my relationship UI talk last year, which is talking about beginning to use pleasantries and pronouns with these bots. When does the user ask the bot something about themselves or allow the bot to initiate a conversation with them? In other words, it's not just the user saying, hey, I need something. The bot all of a sudden is allowed to talk to the person on their own. These are types of things you can simulate and observe without having to build an LLM. You can just put someone in a Slack channel, an iMessage, any kind of messaging platform, and let them converse with a bot that's being played by a person. We also learned things I didn't expect to learn. We got like bonus learnings, right? Around things like latency, which is really important, and how asynchronous communication really works. So I'll give you an example that I learned that might feel really obvious in hindsight, but I would invite you to think about your last text conversation. Were you really taking turns, like individual turns, where you were saying something and then the other person was responding? No, probably not. That's not how human asynchronous conversation works. You probably said something like, hey, Bob, how was your weekend? And Bob said, it was great. I had a really great hike and went on a picnic with my family. How was yours? And when you respond, you're going to ask about the hike and the picnic, and you're also going to tell Bob about your weekend. And now, almost without even knowing that you did it, you have two nested conversations happening in parallel, which is really easy for humans to track because we've been doing it for a really long time. And that's how our brains work. But it's really hard to train bots how to do that. And yet for relationship to exist, we have to create it. That's a very concrete example of something that we witnessed that, again, might seem obvious in hindsight, but is really hard to build for. So what I want you to see is that we were able, by even testing with what feels like tin cans and string, to be able to prove and disprove assumptions rapidly. Another example of something that we learned early on, and this is something that you're seeing shipping in things like GPT now, is that, another Kevin Roose article back in the day, if you were following, was when he was using the Bing chatbot, and he, after talking to it for 2.5 hours, had discovered that there was an underlying subconscious named Sydney that then tried to talk him into, getting divorced, right? That's because of model drift, and model drift was hugely problematic. And the only solution we could come up with at the time was turn capping, which meant that after a certain number of turns, I speak, bot speaks, I speak, bot speak, I speak, bot speaks, we cut the whole conversation off and reset the model to prevent drift from happening. So, okay, that is one way to solve that problem. But what we found is that then that bred a new generation of problems around the concept that every time you talk to the bot, it had no idea who you were. There was no memory, right? And so being able to see that that was going to cause people to churn because there was no reason to come back. We had no context. And Kevin and Jonathan are going to talk a little bit about context tomorrow, actually. So I would encourage you to tune into that talk to learn a little more technically on how that works in products. That helped us prioritize memory as something we wanted to build as a big, hard, important feature back to this dual level of prioritization. We were able to bring that up in our roadmap and start thinking about how we were going to dedicate time and resources to thinking about what memory really looks like. Okay, one last thing on this slide before we move on. I'm talking about experiments that were run in the very early days of these kinds of models being publicly available. if I were building tests like this today, you can bet that my humans in the loop would be using models of their own to generate content if it made sense to do so. So I want to make sure I tag that on. There's lots and lots of ways to build these things that don't cost you so much latency and asynchronicity that you lose the experience. So again, like as these tools become more ubiquitously available, know that there are ways to kind of continue to bring them in without first having to build your own. Okay, so I also talked about this at the beginning, this flavor of control or lack of control that the users are going to feel, which is that sooner or later, you're going to have to account in your product development process for the fact that the users themselves are building the mental model of how to use this product while they're using it. And this is where in longitudinal practice, you have to graduate to stepping away from the product, having less control of your environment. So you can witness how they truly use it, how they talk to it, and how it affects them when you're not looking over their shoulder. In addition, you'll have to be thoughtful about how many mental models you're asking the users to build and how fast. So everyone, for example, is really excited about the promise of an LLM-based assistant, bringing assistance to everybody, everywhere, true assistance, right? But if you think about that, you have to first remember that many of your users probably have never used a human assistant, because that's just not something that most people in, the general United States have had access to, or the world, right? So you're not just moving a known experience to a digital platform. You're first expecting them to successfully learn to delegate to another person, and then hoping they'll do that in a digital faceless way, right? With all the trust that comes with it. The canonical example here is that I don't ever delegate, when I delegate to my spouse, I might say, oh, don't forget to bring yogurts home, right? There's so much context in there. It's 6 Dannon, fruit on the bottom, lemon yogurts that are 2% milk, right? Like with that much fat in them. If I have to actually say all that out loud, that's going to take a lot of mental load and brain power to put together. And then you're asking me to do it digitally, right? While I'm driving my car. It's just a very different mental model, and you're building 2 at the same time. So you need to account for that in your product development. And in addition to the complexity inherent to this type of technology, you're also introducing a new stochastic nature of product development, which again, Kevin and Jonathan are going to talk about tomorrow. So individual commands, even if issued identically, will produce different results. The model could change because you might change it, and the user might perceive the model to be changing even when it isn't. So unlike products in the past, there will not be a sense of mastery that users achieve, or at least it won't happen at the speed that we're conditioned to expect because of that relationship. And even something as simple as onboarding is going to have to change. Users have to learn how to use the products, but the products have to learn the user too to be truly useful to them. So to test these things, you have to give users access to the product over time where you can step away. It seems risky and scary, especially if you're doing this for the first time, but with the right recruiting, consents, and structure in place, you can create a program that helps your team feel like they've launched this product with all the safety and security of a typical user study, which is really critical. And not to say these things aren't without difficulties. In my very first one of these experiments, we had a fire drill on the very first weekend, Friday night, 10:30 p.m., and had to call everybody in because in spite of best countless practices and guardrails, the product just misbehaved. It sucked, but it was a really great learning opportunity for us and the team about what we needed to have in place when we launched. So this comes back as we kind of wrap this topic up to what we talked about earlier, which is I want you to remember that you don't know how it works, and nobody does. We're not studying products anymore. We're studying experiences and ecosystems, and we are going to have to challenge the orthodoxies we've built over the last 30 years. And that doesn't mean it's all for naught. Many things are the same. A lot of what you know is going to be leverageable here, but the few things that are different are going to require us to be willing to reinvent ourselves. And with a dash of curiosity and our tireless advocacy for our users, I know we can get there together. I want to end where I began, which is on a note of what will be left for humanity when this new technology upends our current way of doing business. The answer is a lot. If we're using these technologies right, in the development of the product and in the products themselves, we should be taking care of tasks that humans will never compete with machines on, like synthesis, so that we can afford humans the opportunity to think critically, develop opinions, and advocate for them. Creativity, accountability, and authenticity are going to be the new markers of humanity. And I, for one, am really excited about that. As a researcher, relearning how my practice is going to work going forward, as a human looking down the path of my career and the rest of my life, and as a mother raising children who every single day are reminding me how to marvel at being human. So thank you so much for your time and attention. I know we only have 4 minutes left for questions, so there's no way that I will be able to do justice all the questions you have now, but I hope that this serves as a springboard and an offering for us to engage going forward. Please find me on LinkedIn. I'm open to coffee chats. Just come get me if you have questions, and please get involved and be part of the space. We absolutely need you. Thanks so much. Okay, I see some comments in the chat. So just because I'm looking at the Q&A, I will start there. The recording question is not for me to answer, but I'll answer this question from John. How have you made your partners more comfortable with the idea of experimenting and fast failing? This is such an important question. And in fact, I'm literally writing failure metrics into our team charter today because failure is really critical and you have to do it. I think for me, in this, I'll speak specifically to the Gen AI LLM space. Failing is inevitable because you can't control the model, right? And so I think you can think about failure as you get to do a lot of little failures in a place that's tightly controlled, or you are basically gambling with the fact that you could have a massive failure that is going to be on the front page of the Times, right? Like, so why not get more comfortable with failing early on and learning how to, have as much control as you possibly can? I think that's kind of the way I would open that conversation. How I've gotten it done in the past is that, like I even had a conversation today that was like, we shouldn't assume that we are going to continue a product. We should assume that we're going to kill a product, and it should be on the product team to prove to us that we need to keep investing in this. These things are not cheap, and if we're doing this right, we should be killing a lot more things than we're making. But obviously, a much broader conversation. I appreciate the question, John. Jennifer, I see your question. You mentioned doing Wizard of Oz testing. How does that compare with real observations with the real product? Great question. I think this comes down to experiment design, right? Like there are things that, especially if you're doing Wizard of Oz testing in a live setting where like I've got humans on one side of a screen and other humans on a different side of a screen and they're talking to each other, there are things in that session that we probably will see and things in that session that we won't. What we will not see is how people really behave with the real model. They're never going to ask it, a personal question in that setting, right? Like we know that. And yet they might ask you a deeply personal question. Like one question, there was a mom that was in one of my studies that was asking a lot of questions about like feeling like a bad mom, right? Like to a newborn baby because she was having some breastfeeding issues. Like you're not going to see that in a live session. And yet that's an actually really important thing to observe as a really meaningful, empathetic opportunity to experiment with LLMs in the wild. So I think it comes down to defining the experiment correctly, designing and defining the experiment correctly. What assumptions are you testing? What questions can you answer in a discrete setting? And how can we kind of make sure that we're designing the right kind of solving the right problem with the right tool, I guess, if that makes sense. Great question. Okay, Elle, I don't know if I am supposed to stop right now or if I can take one more.
I think you can take the last one before we.
Great. Okay, AH asks, talking of Wizard of Oz testing, any tips on doing this where customer brand trust is a very sensitive topic? Yes. The answer is that, double blind as much as you possibly can, single blind, session blind. There's lots and lots of blinded options out there, depending on what you feel is best. In all the studies I've done, I think all of them, they've been at least session blind, if not blind, double blind. So that can be, depending on the size of your company, that can mean inviting a vendor in to actually run the test so that you can step out. That's often what I do is I write the tests and I design everything, but I don't actually run them so that we can truly be blinded. That can mean, if you're working for a little bit of a stealth startup, that might be easier than if it's very easy to look you up on Google, on LinkedIn, right? And see where you work. I have the benefit of having a very boring name, so it's hard to find me sometimes actually. But I do have a very distinct look, so it's easy for people to find me if they know what they're looking for. So I would just look into consents and blinded experiments that would help you out. And if you have bigger organization access to funds, sometimes inviting in a vendor or even like a contractor can help you add that one more layer of anonymity in the tests that you're running. Again, like the tests that you're running are not going to be testing things like brand yet. You're going to be testing the actual core of the product. And then you can kind of have other folks in the organization help you understand how to test and experiment with the brand. But this is something, especially in a world where you can't control, brands are not used to being told that they can't control things, right? So, and folks that work in marketing and brand are not used to being told they can't control things. And there are very public examples of that having gone wrong in the early days of GPT being AI barred, all that stuff. So you don't have to look far to find some examples of that. And that is why I would, the more that you can blind it, keep it at arm's length until you're ready to go is going to be important. Cool. Thank you so much for having me and for your time and attention. I'll look through the chat and see if there's any other questions to answer, but I really appreciate you all and have a great day.